Admirals, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me join my colleagues in congratulating the Commander of the Sri Lankan Navy and all of his colleagues, visible and invisible, for choreographing such a superb naval conference. We have been extraordinarily fortunate to have been invited to participate in this outstanding naval exercise. What you see before you is in many ways a classic illustration of naval cooperation at work. A young Canadian naval commander, the commanding officer of Her Majesty's Canadian ship Vancouver, collaborating with his Australian, New Zealand, and American colleagues in disaster relief in New Zealand recently as a result of a major earthquake in the northern corner of the southern island of New Zealand. But I'm going to break from the more traditional vision of naval cooperation and address this phenomenon from a somewhat different perspective. Yesterday, we were treated to wonderful presentations by our professional colleagues on the sociology of partnership. Professor Till, one of the world's great authorities on naval issues, gave us valuable insights into the dynamics of partnership. We also were introduced to the taxonomy of organizations, a breathtaking array of organizations dedicated to partnership and cooperation of one sort or another. And we were given some very telling illustrations by our Australian colleague, Rear Admiral Laver, about the way in which partnership can function in a benign fashion to advance the interests of us all in the ocean's commons. But in fact, there's an exquisite irony at the heart of all of this, in the sense that some of our partnerships, in fact, are really exercises in hedging at the geostrategic level. I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the environment in the Indo-Pacific region is increasingly brittle and problematic, that much of the cooperation that we have engaged in has been in an effort to secure ourselves over and against an increasingly uncertain future. What you see is, of course, the American rebalance to the Pacific, well known to each and every one of you as professionals in this room. Our colleagues in Beijing, I think, would suggest that as part of the victimhood narrative, which is so common in Beijing, that in fact their actions at sea are in response to the American rebalance. I would suggest to you that in fact a careful assessment of the chronology of events would no longer support this interpretation, that in fact a dramatic shift in tone in China with respect to its oceanic approaches predated the declarations which we now associate with the American rebalance and the asymmetric deployment of naval assets into the region. I would suggest to you that Joseph Nye's hub and spokes analogy from the late 1980s is in fact not only being added to with a critical Washington-New Delhi axis, but in fact the architecture of power in the Indo-Pacific region is now in fact becoming much more like a spider web rather than hub and spokes. That the participants at the end of the spokes are beginning to in fact collaborate in partnerships across the traditional lines. Thus, for example, we see a growing relationship between the Japanese and the Filipinos, or the Japanese and the Vietnamese, or the Japanese and the Indians, to cite only one example. Indian movement eastward, coming at exactly the moment that the Chinese are beginning to move westward. We have, I would suggest to you, whether it's polite or not, a structure of containment light, as I would refer to it. A de facto relationship between navies in the region over and against uncertainty as to what China's endgame is. What we see is a rising hegemon that has discovered the true potential of the sea, and that puts China on a collision course with the United States, which has traditionally exercised power to the benefit of almost everyone in this room over the past 70 years. The Chinese are engaged in a classic weaker naval strategy, although the figures in terms of hulls would argue otherwise, in a sea denial strategy. I mentioned a moment ago that I thought that the environment was increasingly brittle and problematic, and perhaps the iconic moment was in March of 2010 with the sinking of the Cheonan by the North Koreans. The Cheonan has been brought up on the hard, as navalists would say, and they have positioned the stern and the bow in such a way to represent how the vessel would have looked originally, but in the middle, 8 meters of jagged metal and twisted cables, a mute testimony to the 46 young sailors who died as a result of this act of war. So in many ways, what you see there is illustrative of a change in tone, whereas the Atlantic is small, empty, and non-confrontational. The Pacific, I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is sadly increasingly confrontational, which on the one hand puts a premium on the very theme which we've addressed in this conference, and on the other hand plays out in the necessity for greater cooperation over and against an uncertain future. And as I suggest in my slide, offshore disputes have multiplied in this part of the world and are a source of constant friction. All this as part, as every one of you in this room knows all too well, of a dramatic global shift in the center of naval gravity. When I was a young navigating officer in the Royal Navy Reserve long ago and far away, the RN had 152 frigates and destroyers. It now has 19. In the past quarter century, the Chinese, to give only one example, have built over 330 surface vessels, exclusive of submarines. And I would suggest to you that what we have now is an unprecedented correlation of naval power. India, Japan, China, and of course the United States. And a dramatic rise in naval assets throughout the region. I would in fact perhaps break with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sakuja, in suggesting that I would support the late Desmond Ball's assertion that we probably are in the midst of a regional arms race. We've gone beyond mere modernization, the addition of assets, to an action-reaction mode, which is in fact deeply disturbing in many ways. And at the heart of it, as all of you are aware, is the dramatic proliferation of submarines. What you see on the screen, ladies and gentlemen, is in many ways a cartoon, in the sense that it is not up to date. And as all of you are aware, a number of the participants in this room are already in the process of exploring the addition of submarines. We have, to use an old Pentagon expression, a submarine-rich environment, and that increases the likelihood of miscalculation. And you can see the dramatic growth over the past 25 years in the submarine fleets. An interesting sidebar, but one which is increasingly disturbing. In the lower right, you'll see Doughboy, Kim Fatty III, as the Chinese are wont to say, although they're now banned from saying that. And what we're looking at could have been photoshopped, but is probably real. We see Kim Jong-un observing what may be a preliminary test of a submarine-launched ballistic missile. A development which could fundamentally alter the security architecture of the Korean Peninsula and surrounding land masses and seas. Part of an increasingly disturbing trend in which ballistic missiles go to sea, and it's important to realize that not only have navies grown in size, in sophistication and capability, but we have, particularly in the eastern, or rather the western Pacific, an astonishing proliferation of missiles aimed at ships and aimed at terrestrial targets. Here we can see in the upper left a graph from The Economist newspaper. It's a little out of date, but what it suggests, of course, is the numeric conjunction between the number of ships that the Chinese have built, and their accomplishment is truly astonishing, and they have become profoundly Mahanian in their outlook towards naval power. In that little red circle is the point where the PLAN has surpassed the United States Navy in terms of the number of hulls. And this, in many ways, is iconic of the dramatic shift which has occurred in the outlook of the Chinese. Indeed, I would suggest to you that the Chinese rediscovery of the sea in the latter quarter of the 20th century, along with the end of the Cold War and the meteoric rise of the Chinese economy, was in fact a truly global phenomenon which has set the stage for the first quarter of this century and in fact provided an enormous challenge. What the Chinese have in mind is in many ways entirely legitimate in terms of their reading of naval history. As Mahan would have suggested, simplistically, great nations have great navies. And this is certainly something that our colleagues in Beijing have embraced. And here I draw your attention, of course, to the action-reaction mode, which is occurring not only in terms of carriers, and there's a sort of ultimate irony in this, that at the very time that many would suggest that perhaps carriers are at the end of their lifespan, we are in fact seeing major navies move into the carrier business. What's interesting is the astonishing array of vessels that have come down the slipways in China, and here is a brief menu of some of them. We've already been exposed to these maps in earlier presentations. In the lower right, of course, the Silk Route. And parenthetically, there's some rather interesting questions that one could pose about the degree to which an economy in China which has begun to wane will in fact be able to realize this grandiose maritime and terrestrial ambition. Because, of course, you can also see the Trans-Eurasian, one belt, or one road, I should say, process which leads away from Xi'an all the way to Duisburg in Germany. At the heart of the upper left, of course, is Malacca, that fabled and enormously strategic strait. I was always intrigued by the Chinese anxiety about the integrity of the Strait of Malacca. The Chinese, of course, have diversified mightily in the past 20 years in terms of energy sources. And there are many alternatives to the Strait of Malacca which are acceptable within the bounds of additional cost. But be that as it may, what we've seen, of course, is that as part of this larger Eurasian vision, we see energy scheduled, so we're told, to flow from Pakistan to Kashgar and similarly from Burma into Yunnan. So an integration across the whole of the vast Eurasian landmass of energy flows and an increasing Chinese maritime footprint in the Indian Ocean. So there's an irony as the Chinese move west, India and others move east. And what we've seen, of course, is an increasing number of provocative and vexatious and tense standoffs at sea. Here in the upper left, we see what the Japanese would call the Senkaku, a cluster of rocky outcrops with virtually no value whatsoever in and of themselves. But of course, were they to qualify as islands, and indeed the recent Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling calls that into question, What you would see, of course, as all of you are aware, is the attribution of a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which would provide rich resources, potentially in oil and gas, and perhaps even more importantly, in fish. Fish are not particularly attractive creatures in terms of geopolitical debate. But as we've already seen with IUU fishing, I would suggest to you that as we stand over the horizon, we will need greater and greater partnership to deal with the dramatic decline in global and regional fish stocks. Analysis suggests that, in fact, that decline could be precipitous. How will we position ourselves, particularly when huge proportions of Asian societies rely on maritime resources? Here in the lower graph, what we see is Chinese intrusions into the Senkaku space. Interesting to plot those over and against larger tensions, also to plot them against what is happening in terms of domestic politics in China itself, because much of what we see is reflective of internal tensions in Beijing. And here, of course, the South China Sea, with, in the right, the 9-dash line, or quite possibly the 10-dash line, or quite possibly the 11-dash line, since all of those have appeared. Quite remarkably, I have a young daughter, and I was looking at her school globe the other day and saw the faintest outline of the 9-dash line, which I can only imagine comes from the #1 Shenzhen school globe factory in southern China, and they have been invited to add the 9-dash line to their school globes. Beijing, I have to confess, has been remarkably opaque in terms of actually describing what this means. Does it award to the People's Republic control of all the waters inside the 9-dash line, or only the geographic features? And I think we have to emphasize the word geographic features, because journalistically it's easy to refer to islands, but in fact, as the permanent court ruling suggests, there are virtually no islands in the Spratlys in the southern half of the contested area. So we can see on the left how enormously complex the claims and counterclaims are in the South China Sea. Sadly, detailed and comprehensive reviews of the oil and gas resources of the South China Sea have never been carried out. Chinese assessments of oil and gas are orders of magnitude greater than American assessments. But we frankly have no real idea what are the fossil fuel resources that lie beneath the South China Sea. And here we see something which has captured our attention, where in fact Beijing has taken a page straight out of Putin's playbook. This is the Crimea played out at sea, slice by slice. And indeed, other claimants have also reclaimed territory in the South China Sea, but as we can see, there are, in the second bullet, orders of magnitude difference in terms of land reclamation. The critical issue, of course, frequently lost sight of, is that a submerged geographic feature, even if it is built to be the size of Manhattan, remains a submerged geographic feature without any territorial sea attached thereto. What's disturbing as well is the presence of airstrips which enable a lily pad approach all the way down across the South China Sea in terms of air power, something which changes the dynamic. You'll be well acquainted with the picture in the upper left, the Sierra Madre. 7 or 8 poor hapless Filipino sailors spend their time manning this hulk, which has been run up on the reef as a way of demonstrating Filipino sovereignty. The whole issue of sovereignty, of course, is now very much up for grabs. How are we to assess Duterte's recent overtures to Beijing? But far more important, I would suggest to you, is the upper right. Because what we can see is that there are an enormous number of fishing vessels operating in the South China Sea. Just the other day, I was flying a helicopter over a part of the South China Sea, and there were fishing vessels as far as one could see in all directions. What's truly disturbing, I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is the way in which the Chinese have harnessed their fishing fleets in a paramilitary fashion, exploiting a deep uncertainty in terms of rules of engagement on the part of many of us operating in those waters. Are these vessels civilian vessels? Are they not? All the evidence from analysts around the world suggests that, in fact, many of these vessels are utilized in a form of paramilitary, as paramilitary proxies, while the Coast Guard lies at mid-distance and the PLAN lies over the horizon. We know that they are, in fact, orchestrated by the PLAN, provided the subsidies and equipment in order to, in fact, interfere in operations of civilian and other craft in the South China Sea. This, I would suggest to you, is a source, to my mind, of increasing importance in the sense that we need to address the inadequacy of UNCLOS when it comes to the utilization of marine militias of this sort. CUES, which was the jewel in the crown in Qingdao at the Western Pacific Naval Symposium some years ago, of course, has only voluntary adherence, and that for warships, not for Coast Guards or not for fishing vessels. How are we to respond? What are to be our rules of engagement when we're confronted by fishing vessels? We need to cooperate across navies, and the great strength that navies have is the fraternity of the Nelsonian band of brothers. We need to cooperate to achieve a common operating picture and a common operating approach to these sorts of threats to peace and instability at sea. And of course, as all of you are aware, in July of this year, the Permanent Court of Arbitration brought down its ruling as a result of the application by the Philippines government. I would invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to look at the bullets at the lower left, because this is a summary of the critical issues which the PCA ruled on. What we have, of course, is not only a resounding victory for Manila, but a much larger and more vexatious and disturbing issue. And that's, how do we in fact move, and this is a common theme that's run through the past day and a half, how do we move in a world of norms and values of international law if in fact critical players simply choose to ignore their obligations under international law? This is a serious challenge, and once again highlights, as this conference has done, the paramount importance of cooperation. What the PCA did was to bring an element of clarity to UNCLOS, the world's greatest constitutional vehicle. And that clarity, in fact, is, I think, extraordinarily important. And what's also important, I think, is that, as suggested yesterday, in the Indian Ocean, there are some very telling and mature examples of states that have gone to international arbitration and then honored the result rather than responding petulantly. So, what I've attempted to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is that, as all of you are aware, the Indo-Pacific maritime landscape is one that is subject to greater and greater challenges. There is more and more need to move beyond jaw, talk, to action. Sadly, many of the organizations which were enumerated yesterday have in fact proved to be rather ineffectual, or completely ineffectual. Indeed, their effect is almost in inverse proportion to the number of such organizations. It requires us to redouble our efforts, because what I would suggest to you in conclusion is that the number of friction points is rising daily. I think the grown-ups are aware of the danger, but in many cases, hostilities result at the mid-level, at the commander on the bridge of a ship faced with a sudden unexpected situation. So we need to work doubly hard, I think, to foster the sort of cooperation and partnership which is the central theme for this conference. Thank you very much.